That is exactly how this aircraft sounded. Not the engine roar every propeller fighter of the Second World War produced, but that rising, unmistakable whistle underneath it, air tearing through a set of intake ducts built into the wings themselves. By 1944, Japanese troops dug into the hills and jungles of the Solomon Islands and the Philippines had learned to recognize that specific sound, rising over the tree line before the aircraft making it ever came into view, and to understand exactly what it meant. They had a name for it. They called it whistling death. Pause on that. An aircraft earning a nickname like that from the men it was hunting is, on its own, a remarkable thing. What makes this particular story worth telling is who else, on the American side, had already given this same airplane an entirely different nickname months earlier for entirely different reasons. The Ensign Eliminator, a fighter the United States Navy judged after watching its own test pilots nearly crash it into a carrier deck, too dangerous to operate from a ship at all. This is not a story about one distinctive engine note. This is the story of how an aircraft the Navy itself initially refused to fly at sea became the single sound Japanese ground troops feared most in the sky. Part 1. The Corsair existed because of one very specific engineering problem: how to wrap an airframe around the most powerful aircraft engine the United States had yet built. Vought designed the F4U from the outset around the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower, the first fighter in American service built specifically to house it. An engine that powerful needed an enormous propeller, over 13 feet across, to convert that power into thrust efficiently. And a propeller that large needed enough ground clearance that a conventional straight wing would have required absurdly long, fragile landing gear legs to keep the blades from striking the runway. Vaught's engineers solved the problem with the aircraft's signature inverted gull wing, bent downward at the root before angling back up toward the tips, a shape that let the landing gear mount at the lowest point of the bend, short and strong, while still leaving the enormous propeller the clearance it needed. In testing in 1940, the resulting aircraft became the first American fighter to exceed 400 miles an hour in level flight, a genuine milestone. Vought itself had been competing for the Navy's 1938 request for a new carrier fighter against several rivals, and the design that became the F4U beat them not on any single dramatic innovation, but on the sheer confidence of pairing an airframe directly to the most powerful engine available, rather than adapting an existing design around it. A bet that paid off in raw speed and climb rate the moment the prototype flew, even before anyone had fully solved the handling problems that bet would eventually create. Part 2. That same engine, and the ducting built around it, is what gave the Corsair its unmistakable voice. Air feeding the aircraft's oil coolers and supercharger intercoolers was drawn in through slots built into the leading edges of the wing roots, close to the fuselage, and at the speeds the Corsair was capable of, especially in a dive, air rushing through those slots produced a distinct, rising whistle, unlike the sound of any other Allied fighter in the Pacific. Pilots and ground crews on both sides eventually learned to identify aircraft by ear long before they came into visual range, reading engine notes and propeller pitch the way sailors read a ship's silhouette, and the Corsair's whistle became one of the most recognizable sounds in that particular vocabulary, specific enough that Japanese troops on the ground did not need to see the gull-winged shape overhead to know exactly which American fighter was coming. Ground crews maintaining Corsairs at forward airstrips in the Solomons faced their own version of the aircraft's demanding reputation, since an engine putting out 2,000 horsepower required correspondingly serious upkeep in primitive island conditions: humid air, coral dust, and improvised tools, and mechanics who kept the Double Wasp running reliably under those conditions did as much to make the aircraft's combat record possible as any pilot in the cockpit. Part 3. Long before Japanese troops had any reason to fear that sound, the United States Navy's own test pilots had already concluded the aircraft attached to it was nearly too dangerous to fly onto a carrier deck at all. The Corsair's long nose needed to balance that oversized engine and propeller, blocked a landing pilot's forward view during precisely the final seconds of an approach when he most needed to see the deck and the landing signal officer guiding him in. Its main landing gear, meanwhile, used oleo struts that tended to bottom out on touchdown and then rebound, bouncing the aircraft back into the air over the arresting wires rather than catching one cleanly. In the fall of 1942, Lieutenant Commander Sam Porter took a Corsair aboard the escort carrier USS Sangamon to test exactly this problem, and after 4 landings so alarming he judged the aircraft was on the verge of killing him, he called the test off. The Navy's conclusion was blunt. The airplane that would go on to terrify Japanese ground troops by sound alone was, for the time being, judged unfit to operate from the very ships its own service depended on, and handed instead to Marine Corps squadrons flying from fixed island airstrips, where a long nose and a bouncing undercarriage mattered far less than raw performance in the air. Torque from that same enormous engine and propeller created its own quirks in flight, a tendency for the aircraft to snap into a sudden left-wing stall at low airspeed if a pilot pulled power on too aggressively, a characteristic responsible for at least part of the training accident record that helped earn the Corsair its Ensign Eliminator nickname among Navy and Marine aviators well before the aircraft ever encountered an enemy fighter. None of these quirks were unique in kind to the Corsair. Most high-powered piston fighters of the era demanded real skill and respect from their pilots. What set the Corsair apart was the degree to which several of these demands, torque sensitivity, restricted forward visibility, and undercarriage bounce, stacked on top of one another at precisely the moment, final carrier approach, when a pilot had the least margin to manage all 3 at once. Part 4. Those Marine squadrons took the Corsair into combat for the first time on the 11th of February, 1943, when a dozen F4U-1s of VMF 124, commanded by Major William E. Geiss, flew out of Henderson Field on Guadalcanal to escort a rescue flight near Vella La Vella. Their first real engagement came 3 days later, on the 14th, escorting a formation of B-24 Liberators against a Japanese airfield at Kahili, alongside P-38s and P-40s, and it did not go well. Japanese fighters contested the raid hard, and the Americans lost 4 P-38s, 2 P-40s, 2 Corsairs, and 2 of the bombers they were supposed to be protecting. It was, in its own smaller way, as rough an introduction to combat as the aircraft could have had. It did not stay that way for long. By May 1943, VMF 124 had produced the Corsair's first ace, Second Lieutenant Kenneth A. Walsh, who would finish the war with 21 confirmed victories. And Marine Corsair squadrons across the Solomons were beginning to turn the tables decisively against Japanese fighters that had dominated the skies over the Pacific since 1941. Guadalcanal itself, where the Corsair flew its first combat mission, had already been the site of some of the most brutal fighting of the entire Pacific War for 6 months by the time VMF 124 arrived. Ground troops and naval forces on both sides locked in a grinding campaign for a single airstrip that had already cost thousands of lives before a single Corsair ever took off from it. The aircraft's Marine pilots were, in a real sense, arriving late to a fight the rest of the theater had already been paying for since the previous August. And the reputation the Corsair built over the following 2 years was built on top of a campaign whose earlier, hardest fighting it had missed entirely. Part 5. No Corsair unit built a more fearsome reputation than Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington's VMF 214, nicknamed the Black Sheep Squadron, which claimed 94 confirmed kills across barely 12 weeks of combat over the Solomons in late 1943. In one especially brazen mission, Boyington led 24 Corsairs directly over the heavily defended Japanese airfield at Kahili, and deliberately provoked roughly 60 enemy fighters into scrambling to meet him, a fight the Black Sheep won decisively, downing 20 Japanese aircraft without losing a single Corsair of their own. Boyington himself would finish the war as one of the Marine Corps' top-scoring aces, credited with 28 victories, and received the Medal of Honor for his squadron's aggressive combat record, though his own war did not end cleanly. He was shot down over Rabaul in January 1944, and spent the rest of the war as a prisoner, surviving to be released after Japan's surrender. Boyington himself had an unusual path to the Black Sheep Squadron's cockpit, even by the standards of marine aviation. having already resigned from the Marine Corps once before the war to fly for the American volunteer group in China, the Flying Tigers, before rejoining as the Pacific War drew him back into uniform, a background that made him older and considerably more experienced than most of the junior pilots he ended up commanding over the Solomons. Part 6. It was performances like the Black Sheep's, repeated across dozens of squadrons and hundreds of engagements through 1943 and 1944, that built the Corsair's reputation into something close to dread among the Japanese pilots and ground forces who faced it. Widely cited figures put the Corsair's overall kill ratio against Japanese aircraft somewhere around 11-1 across the Pacific War, a number this channel would rather present as a commonly repeated estimate than as a single, precisely audited figure, since different tallies compiled from different unit records and different post-war historians have not always agreed down to the decimal. What is not in serious dispute is the direction of that ratio, decisively in the Corsair's favor, or the fact that a Japanese soldier who had learned to associate a specific whistling engine note with fighters that shot down or strafed everything they targeted had every practical reason to fear that sound the moment it reached his ears, whether or not he ever caught sight of the aircraft making it. The Japanese pilots defending against Corsair squadrons through 1943 and 1944 were themselves increasingly drawn from a thinner, less experienced pool than the seasoned aviators who had swept across the Pacific in the war's opening year, a consequence of accumulating losses and a training pipeline that could not replace veteran pilots as fast as attrition removed them. Part of the widening kill ratio this channel has already flagged as an estimate rather than an audited figure reflects that shifting balance in pilot experience as much as it reflects any single quality of the aircraft itself, a nuance easy to lose in a story built around one airplane's reputation. Part 7. The Navy's own verdict on the aircraft changed more slowly than its reputation among the enemy did. It was, notably, not American engineers who finally solved the carrier landing problem that had grounded the Corsair from ship duty in 1942, but pilots of Britain's Fleet Air Arm, operating Corsairs supplied under Lend-Lease, who worked out a long, curving landing approach that kept the flight deck in the pilot's sight around that oversized nose for as long as possible before the final flare and touchdown, sacrificing a straight-in approach for one that traded a few extra seconds of maneuvering for constant visual reference to the deck. British engineers also addressed the bouncing undercarriage directly, modifying the oleo strut valve to soften the gear's rebound on landing. Those fixes, developed and proven first by an Allied Navy rather than the Corsair's own manufacturer or its own service, eventually let the U.S. Navy clear the aircraft for full carrier operations later in the war, and by the fighting around Okinawa in 1945, Corsairs were flying from American carrier decks as a matter of routine, a role they had been judged unfit for barely 2.5 years earlier. Whistling Death was not the only nickname the Corsair collected on the Japanese side of the war, and it is worth being honest that this channel could not independently verify a single named Japanese account describing the moment troops first coined the phrase. What survives in the historical record is the nickname itself, widely reported across American wartime and post-war sources, rather than a first-person Japanese account of its origin. That is a meaningfully different kind of evidence than a documented quote from a named individual, and this channel would rather note the distinction plainly than present the nickname's origin story with more certainty than the sources actually support. Part 8. The honest version of this story runs in two directions that do not fully resolve into a single, tidy arc, and it is worth naming both plainly rather than picking the more flattering one. On one side, an engine and an airframe combination that Japanese ground troops learned, correctly, to fear by sound alone, associating a specific whistle with an aircraft that was shooting down and strafing everything in its path across the Solomons and the Philippines. On the other, the same aircraft grounded from carrier duty for most of that same stretch of the war because its own service judged it too dangerous for its own pilots to land safely at sea, a problem eventually solved not by the Corsair's own country, but by an Allied air arm flying the same airplane under different operational needs. Both of these things were true about the F4U Corsair at the same time for roughly 2 years, and neither cancels the other out. There is also a quieter irony worth sitting with here. An aircraft built around the single most powerful engine available to American designers in 1938, meant above all to fly faster and climb harder than anything else in the sky, ended up being remembered by the enemy it fought not for its speed at all, but for an incidental byproduct of its cooling system, a whistle nobody had set out to design. The engineers who drew up the wing root intake slots that produced that sound were solving a thermal management problem, keeping an engine's oil and supercharged intake air cool enough to survive sustained combat power settings, not writing psychological warfare into the airframe. The fear that sound eventually produced was a side effect of solving a completely different, much less dramatic problem. Kenneth Walsh, the Corsair's first ace, survived the war and remained in the Marine Corps, continuing to fly and eventually retiring after a long career, one of a relatively small number of the war's early Corsair pilots to see the aircraft's full journey from Ensign Eliminator to carrier-qualified fleet fighter. Pappy Boyington came home from Japanese captivity in 1945 to receive the Medal of Honor he had been recommended for before his capture, and lived for decades afterward as one of the most publicly recognized Marine aces of the war. The Corsair's carrier clearance eventually came formally in the closing year of the war, and by the fighting at Okinawa in early 1945, the aircraft had become close enough to a routine carrier fixture that some units flying it there earned the nickname Angels of Okinawa for the close air support they flew over Marines and soldiers fighting ashore, a role that depended entirely on the aircraft finally being trusted to operate from a ship rather than only from a fixed island runway. The Corsair itself stayed in frontline American service far longer than almost any other piston engine fighter of the Second World War, remaining in production into the 1950s and flying combat missions again during the Korean War, nearly a decade after Japanese troops in the Solomons first learned to listen for its whistle in the sky above them. Vought went on building Corsairs for the Navy and Marine Corps for 11 years in total, an unusually long production run for a piston engine fighter designed before the United States had even entered the war. A run that carried the aircraft through the Second World War, straight into Korea, and on into a handful of smaller conflicts afterward, still flying combat missions in some air arms years after most of its wartime contemporaries had been retired to museums. None of that later production longevity was visible to the pilots flying VMF-124's first, costly mission against Kahili in February 1943, any more than the aircraft's eventual carrier career was visible to Lieutenant Commander Sam Porter as he climbed out of a Corsair aboard the Sangamon in 1942, certain the machine underneath him was trying to kill him. Both moments were simply what the Corsair was at that specific point in its service life, before either its combat reputation or its handling problems had been fully worked out. The engineers back at Vaught's Connecticut factory, who had cut those wing root intake slots into the leading edge, never heard the whistle their design produced in actual combat conditions over the Solomons, and had no way of knowing, drafting the shape of an oil cooler duct on paper years earlier, that they were quietly writing the specific sound an entire enemy army would come to associate with sudden death from above. Whatever else changed about the aircraft between its rejected 1942 carrier trials and its routine 1945 deck landings, the whistle itself never did. It was there on Sam Porter's terrifying approach to the Sangamon, and it was there over Kahili when Boyington's Black Sheep baited 60 Japanese fighters into a fight they lost badly, the one constant in an airplane whose reputation, on both sides of the war, kept changing underneath it. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because there are more of these, more aircraft that earn two entirely different reputations on two different sides of the same war at the same time, feared by the enemy pilots and ground troops it hunted, and quietly mistrusted by the very service that had to teach its own pilots to land it safely. The whistle you heard at the start of this video was never a design feature. It was air being forced through an intake slot built for an oil cooler, doing a job it was never meant to do, and becoming, by accident, the most recognizable sound in the sky over the Solomon Islands.